DeFi is decentralized finance, and as a finance layer, I think Bitcoin makes more sense. I think Ethereum has a lot of other technological advantages, right? But I think when it comes to being a unit of account and a unit of money that has the most adoption and acceptance, you cannot compare to Bitcoin. And so just from that fundamental perspective, I think it makes much more sense to be the natural home, right? I think there's other use cases that Ethereum dominates, Solana dominates, a lot of these other L1s that are coming out are going to dominate. But I do think for finance specifically, when privacy is important, sovereignty is important, when decentralization is important, open source is important, you can't really beat Bitcoin.
I wanted to start with Botanix Labs. Can you possibly introduce us to it and describe what you're building at Botanix Labs?
Absolutely. So Botanix Labs is the first fully decentralized EVM L2 that actually runs on Bitcoin. So a little bit about how we came into being. 2 years ago, we were looking at the market, and one of the things we really noticed is the lack of Bitcoin scaling and lack of Bitcoin programmability. So Bitcoin obviously has stood the test of time. It is still by far the largest cryptocurrency, but there isn't much being built on it, which seems counterintuitive looking at the world of applications that are being built on Ethereum, Solana, all of these other chains. So we started thinking about why isn't this being built on Bitcoin? And the immediate insight was the lack of the EVM or the lack of a virtual machine, right? It's really hard to build smart contracts on Bitcoin because it is by nature a very adversarial protocol. And so that was our initial insight that the lack of the EVM was maybe holding Bitcoin back. So we started building towards EVM on Bitcoin, and then we developed our scaling mechanism, which is called the Spiderchain. So again, what you need to know about Bitcoin is it's not Turing complete, so you cannot build rollups on Bitcoin. And so when we thought about what scaling mechanism made most sense, and that is possible within the confines of Bitcoin Core, that's how we came up with the Spiderchain. The best way to think of it is it's randomized rotating multisigs that's secured by a proof of stake consensus mechanism, settled on Bitcoin using Bitcoin as the CAS token and settlement layer. That's a little bit about us. We went into testnet last year, so we've been in testnet for over a year now, building, iterating, and we're about to go to mainnet soon, and we'll be the first Bitcoin L2 that actually runs on Bitcoin.
Nice. Thanks for the overview. So Bitcoin layer 2s have been on the rise over the past year.
Yes.
So how is Spiderchain different from the other Bitcoin layer 2s?
Yes, I think there have been a plethora of layer 2s that have come out over the past year. And it's been really interesting because Bitcoin, as I mentioned, is so hard to build on. So it is tough we've been building this for about 2 years, and it is really, really tough to build on. I think that there's a few things that really differentiate us technologically. The first is, as I mentioned, the fact that we run on Bitcoin. So a lot of the L2s, what they're doing is, locking up Bitcoin in some sort of custodial multisig, bridging that over to Ethereum or Cosmos, and then building a rollup on top of that. That's all well and good, but to us, that's not really building on Bitcoin, right? I think that is going to serve a use case for people that are okay with those risk and trust assumptions of, bridging Bitcoin over to other chains. Those L2s serve a very clear purpose, and there's clearly a market for it, as we've seen with the traction with the L2s. But for us, what's really going to define Bitcoin L2s is more L2s being built natively on Bitcoin. And minimizing trust, because it's really, really tough to be fully trustless, but minimizing trust whilst you're bringing it into an EVM environment. So I would say that is the main technological differentiator. And then, of course, our scaling mechanism, which is called the Spiderchain, which I just mentioned, it is very, very different. We think of it as a completely new layer 2 primitive. When you think of scaling mechanisms, they're roughly subdivided into 2 different approaches. You're either a federated sidechain or you're a rollup. I think we're closer to being a sidechain, and we are starting with the federation, but our goal is to be eventually permissionless. So what I like to say is at Botanix Labs, we're big decentralization maxis. Actually, on our team of 15 people, I'm the only one with an Ethereum background. Everyone else is a pretty hardcore Bitcoin maxi, and they've never really held any other token. And the one thing I've learned being around Bitcoiners is it's decentralization that makes the difference at the end of the day. So we think about decentralization not just from an architectural perspective with that multi-sig mechanism I just described, but also from a node level. So we're starting with this federation, but we eventually want to be fully permissionless, whereby anyone in the world would be able to run a Spiderchain node. So we want to be as permissionless as humanly possible. And I think that's truly what's going to push Bitcoin forward and allow for more programmability, more scaling in a way that makes sense to what makes Bitcoin great.
So after the federation phase, you will have like node operators who can join the network.
Exactly. Yeah.
And how would
people will be able to permissionally enter and exit the network.
Yeah. Can you talk about that process? Like, in what tokens will they earn rewards, and like, what are the steps in getting involved with the network and so on and so forth?
Yeah. So I think what's really, really exciting for us is running on Bitcoin and receiving yield in Bitcoin natively. So one thing that I think the whole industry is a little bit fatigued by is the concept of points and other tokens being used as reward mechanisms. And what we found is most interesting for Bitcoin is this concept of native Bitcoin yield. So all of the yield that is accrued back to the stakers, because we are a proof of stake chain at the end of the day, all the yield that is accrued back to the stakers is in the form of Bitcoin from transaction fees generated on the network. So it's fairly straightforward from that perspective. And that's why there's a lot of excitement around it.
So I want to go back to something that you just mentioned, that you're the only Ethereum background person in the team, right? And the rest, everyone is Bitcoin maxi.
Yeah, mostly, yeah.
So on the website, it caught my attention that you described your mission to bring DeFi back home to Bitcoin. Yeah, I'd love you to elaborate on this. Like, why did you decide to focus on Bitcoin and like depart from Ethereum, or like not pick any other blockchain ecosystem?
Yeah, I think being surrounded by a lot of Bitcoin maxis recently has really it's really rewired my brain back to Bitcoin. So actually I started in Bitcoin initially, but then very quickly pivoted to Ethereum because this was during the ICO era back then. And there was just there's a lot more happening in Ethereum. But when I think about, I've started attending a lot of these technical Bitcoin meetups like BitDevs, which is this Socratic seminar that happens every month with Bitcoin developers. And what's been so interesting to me is what it's solidified in my head is, Bitcoin is, in my opinion, the most perfect cryptocurrency, or getting there. I still think there's a lot of changes that need to be made, but I think it is very close to being the most decentralized and living up to the original ethos of what crypto was meant to be, right? Which is democratizing financial access for the masses. And the reason why I decided to come back to Bitcoin is because I think Bitcoin then has that unique ability to actually fulfill crypto's original mission. The amount of mainstream adoption and acceptance that Bitcoin has, no other cryptocurrency has. The amount of market cap it has, like market size, no other cryptocurrency has. So it just made so much sense to me to just build applications on Bitcoin. Why don't we do that more? And why don't we do that in a way that makes sense for Bitcoin, for Bitcoiners, for people holding an ETF, our parents or relatives? I think there's just so much to build out, but using Bitcoin as this settlement layer, which by far is the most decentralized. And I think for financial applications specifically, decentralization becomes especially pertinent. And I spent my whole life until I moved to the US in the emerging markets. And I think over there, Bitcoin serves a very specific pain point, right? As a store of value and actually as a medium of exchange in a lot of countries as well. And so as someone who's observed that and seen the level of acceptance it has, I think it is the only way forward. And I'm really excited for building more on Bitcoin.
Interesting. How do you evaluate the current stance of Ethereum? I feel like there's like the community is frustrated with the price action, loss of direction, the community is sort of slowed down right now. The attention is on like alternative layer ones. How do you evaluate the current stance of Ethereum?
Interesting. Yeah. So it's really funny because before I started working on Botanix Labs, I was a pretty big ETH maxi because that's where I spent most of my career. And I still believe in Ethereum, and I think there's still a massive use case for it. I think the way that the EF has conducted itself, and I'm a pretty big fan of Vitalik, I think there's a lot of room still, for Ethereum to thrive. And I think with emerging projects like Mega ETH, which is trying to get to real-time transactions. I think there's a lot of potential there, right? But I do think ETH, like a lot of chains, right, is having a bit of an existential crisis. Honestly, so is Bitcoin, right? So is every other chain, right? And I think all of these chains are trying to define what they're going to look like over the next few cycles. I think my analysis as someone who has DeFi'd pretty extensively is I feel like ETH is a bit too intellectual for its own good. And I think what you see in Solana with meme coins, which has sucked all of the liquidity out of the cycle, right, is it doesn't take itself so seriously. And I think that's maybe one thing I've noticed with Ethereum. And I used to be a part of that, so I can say that pretty confidently. I think I was like, oh yes, DeFi is going to change the world. And it is still largely used for gambling, right? And I think the sooner we acknowledge that, the sooner we can have more fun with Ethereum again. That's what I think, at least.
Fair enough. That seems to be the current narrative. Like we need to make it more fun, onboard like the masses through like consumer applications and stuff like that. So
exactly. Yeah, I think it's I don't know. I used to work in traditional finance as well, and traditional finance is also largely full of bullshit and a lot of fluff. And a lot of really complicated things that are meant to appear complicated in order to obfuscate the bigger picture for retail, right? I mean, TradFi is also a rug, right? And so I think we were basically replicating TradFi in all of its pluses and minuses within Ethereum. And it's like, wait, we're recreating these rigged systems. And so it defeats the purpose of crypto. And that's why I'm really excited about doing something different with Bitcoin. You know, when I speak to Bitcoiners, they don't care about looping mechanisms or yield aggregators of like point systems. They're like, I want stable, sustainable yield that comes from things I understand, you know, and that understandability, I mean, Bitcoiners are just much more risk averse than what you will see in the degen culture, which I am very much a part of, right? And so that understandability component has been really interesting for us. There will be all of the degenning on Bitcoin because that is the nature of things, right? That's what happens when you build an open source protocol or platform. But I think over time, the most interesting use cases, especially for the Bitcoiner context, are going to be these simple stablecoin tokenization use cases that you would not expect because it's a very different mindset.
So we're here at SmartCon 2024 in Hong Kong. Can you tell us what brings you here? What are your goals and objectives for this week?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to be working with Chainlink. So I'm an OG Link holder, Marine. So it's actually really cool. When I first started building Botanix Labs, I was like, we need to have Chainlink because they are the most decentralized system out there, which again aligns very well with Bitcoiner ideology. And so we just announced our partnership with them last week. So we're the first Bitcoin L2 they're supporting, which is very exciting, both for their fees, their data streams, preferred reserves, and we are also integrating CCIP as our canonical bridge. And we're very excited to be working with them. And it's been really interesting because, one, the technology, I think, has obviously stood the test of time and continues to be an industry standard. But two, I think Chainlink is a really interesting stalwart within the DeFi ecosystem. You know, they have this pulse on the culture of crypto, but then at the same time, they're also doing all of these really interesting experiments, right, in traditional finance, in the real world, that again are, for me, exciting because it's an actual use case for crypto. And that's what I'm really passionate about. And so we're working with them on a bunch of these really interesting use cases as well. So that's why I'm here, also hanging out in Hong Kong. And, you know, big Bitcoin hub. So excited to meet with a lot of our community here.
I'd also love to talk about your background. So what were you doing before Botanix Labs? And how did you eventually discover crypto?
Yeah, so I discovered crypto, this was around late 2015, which makes me feel really old in this industry. So I was living in Brazil at the time. The real had depreciated about 30% in a year. And I was freaking out because I'm originally Canadian, have a lot of investments in Canada. I was like, I need to find some sort of a solution for this. And I had a lot of friends in Brazil who were fintech entrepreneurs. Brazil is this hub of fintech innovation, interestingly enough. They were like, you should really look into Bitcoin. It's like this new way of thinking about money. And I was like, okay, I'll look into it. So that's when I read the white paper for the first time. And actually today is white paper day. So happy white paper day. It's when the Bitcoin white paper first came out, was October 31st, 2008. So
okay.
That's why today's white paper day. Yeah, Halloween. It's so funny because for me, it's white paper day. It's not Halloween. It's like, oh, right, it's Halloween. Cool. And so, yeah, I think I read the white paper around then as well, all of those years ago. And I remember being like, wow, it unlocks so much for me, again, as someone who has lived all across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and seen all of these similar pain points that are all related to financial inclusion, exclusion, lack of access to, asset formation, capital efficiency. And I just saw Bitcoin being this unlock across all of these markets. And so it's like a switch went off and I got really into it. Got involved in like the Bitcoin technical community in Brazil and South America. And then of course Ethereum and then the whole ICO era. Became quite a heavy trader, built my own liquid fund. And then, I was working at Fireblocks right before this. So that was my first full-time crypto job. And that was cool just to see the spectrum of what's out there in crypto. And and then I met my co-founder and we started working on Botanix Labs. It's been about a year and a half, and it's been, so that's my journey to here.
Nice. What were you doing in Brazil, actually, at the time?
I was actually working in finance, so completely, like, nothing to do with crypto, a very traditional job. So that's why I got way more involved in my side hustle, which was crypto. And it's really interesting because I moved to the US, 6 years ago now to go to business school. And crypto was always just my side hustle. I paid for business school with Bitcoin, with crypto. I mean, with my gains, obviously not actually in crypto. They're very anti-crypto. This was during the bear market. And I was known as the crypto person, in school, but in a not nice way because it was considered to be kind of scammy. And so it's really interesting. Even while I was in business school, I was like, okay, there aren't any job opportunities here. This is just something I need to do on the side. I'm glad I figured out a way to make my passion my full-time job. And that's how I ended up here.
So what's next for Spiderchain and Botanix Labs? What's coming up? So
we're shipping our updated testnet soon, which is really exciting. We're by far going to be the most performant Bitcoin L2. That's EVM. So few seconds of block time, few cents of transaction fees. And that's something we're very excited about, being the most performant as well, in addition to being the most Bitcoiny. And then we're shipping our mainnet soon thereafter, and a lot of really fun activities in the meantime with the Bitcoin community. So actually today, as I mentioned, today's white paper day. There's a Bitcoin bar in New York, and so we're actually doing a celebration with them tonight, the history of Bitcoin. I'm assuming Halloween will have some component as a part of that. But so just doing a lot of fun things to engage the Bitcoin community whilst we wrap up for mainnet.
How do you see the primary use cases of Spiderchain, actually? Yeah,
it's really interesting. I think initially it's going to be a lot of ETH DeFi use cases that are going to be manifested on Bitcoin. I mean, that's what you see so far with Bitcoin BTC Fi. This year, it's largely just been copy-paste from Ethereum, right? So, and I'm sure that's going to be there, but I do think that there's a market for net new use cases that are specific to the Bitcoiner context and backed by real-world assets or backed by Bitcoin. So it's really interesting. I mean, I am a big hater on real-world asset tokenization. I'm like, oh, no one cares. And no one really did, to be quite honest, for a very long time. I think it's the first cycle where it's actually going to become an interesting narrative. And a lot of people have expressed interest in all of that being backed by Bitcoin, right? And so that is an exciting use case that I'm finally excited about. And then I think stable coins, it's really interesting because we're plugged in with these very hardcore Bitcoiners, and they're like, stablecoins are dumb. We should only be transacting in Bitcoin. It's like, well, Bitcoin is not at that point where we've maintained volatility enough for it to serve the stablecoin use case, right? And I know everyone is talking about stablecoins right now with recent market movements, but I do think that's going to be one of the main use cases, right? Using your Bitcoin as collateral to mint stablecoins for interoperability within an on-chain financial ecosystem. So yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, it's interesting. We were analyzing our testnet data from last year. And yeah, a lot of people were deploying meme coin contracts as well on Bitcoin. And I mean, it's not something we were expecting, but it seems to be, obviously we're open source, anyone can build anything on it. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the creativity of what can be unleashed on Bitcoin. And I think aside from the decentralization component, what is also exciting about Bitcoin is like the censorship resistance component. So we've also gotten some really interesting social applications that people are building on Botanix, which is not something I was expecting at all. I was hardcore going into DeFi, but people want to build games, people want to build social, people want to build meme coins. And I'm like, okay, I'm all for the expressivity of Bitcoin, and let the best use case win.
What is the ultimate vision for Spiderchain? Sorry, what's the ultimate?
Very different.
Yeah, what's the ultimate vision for Spiderchain? Like when you think in 3 to 5 years from now, how do you imagine it?
Honestly, we want to build for an entire world that runs on Bitcoin. You know, if you think about Bitcoin as a piece of technology and as a cryptocurrency, as I said, it is by far the best and has stood the test of time, being the most permissionless, being the most decentralized, being the most secure, having 100% uptime, right? That is what you need to rebuild and rethink the world in a way that I think is going to be much more democratic, fair, and open. So we want to be the rails for a world that runs on Bitcoin. You know, that can be on EVM, that can be on SVM, it can be on Move. We're very VM agnostic. I think it's probably going to start with EVM, but I think that Bitcoin, it all comes back to Bitcoin, and that's what we're passionate about building out, but in a way that I would hope actually is a net improvement for the world. And yeah, especially as most of our team has experience in emerging markets in some capacity, we're really excited about, especially championing a lot of those use cases. And yeah, moving the needle forward when it comes to Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. So how do you evaluate the growing DeFi ecosystem in Bitcoin? Do you think at some point DeFi, the place for DeFi will be Bitcoin instead of Ethereum? I
think so, because if you think about it, the whole point of DeFi is decentralized finance. And as a finance layer, I think Bitcoin makes more sense. Bitcoin, as a financialization layer than Ethereum. I think Ethereum has a lot of other technological advantages, right? But I think when it comes to being a unit of account and a unit of money that has the most adoption acceptance, you cannot compare to Bitcoin. And so just from that fundamental perspective, I think it makes much more sense to be the natural home, right? I think there's other use cases that Ethereum dominates, Solana dominates, a lot of these other L1s that are coming out are going to dominate. But I do think for finance specifically, when privacy is important, sovereignty is important, when decentralization is important, open source is important, you can't really beat Bitcoin. BTC-Fi as such right now is not really, I feel like it has not been built out. Mm-hmm. It largely is still running on Ethereum rails. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what a Bitcoin or BTC-Fi ecosystem is actually going to look like that runs on Bitcoin. I think my biggest point of hesitation is if we literally just copied and pasted everything from Ethereum over to Bitcoin. I think that's, again, going to defeat the purpose and limit the scope of the market. I think there needs to be innovators that come in and think of, as I mentioned, net new things you can do with Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And that's what is really, really exciting to me.
Do you have any examples of net new things?
Honestly, one that I was really excited about is decentralizing mining hash rate within Bitcoin. So if you think about Bitcoin, it is, despite being one of the most decentralized protocols, hash rate is a very centralized process. So being able to decentralize parts of mining, I think, is really cool. And again, serving an actual pain point that exists. So we have a team building that on Botanix. And I think that's really cool. I think, as I told you, there's the social application. They're trying to build a decentralized Reddit to express political opinions. And they would only do it on Bitcoin because they only trust the decentralization, censorship resistance of Bitcoin. So it's really interesting. the use cases that can develop on Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin-backed stablecoins are obviously going to be huge because Bitcoin over time has proved asset hardness in a way that, again, no other cryptocurrency has, and such makes it a very, very natural hedge and backing asset for any sort of stablecoin in the world. And I even think payments is really interesting. So we work a lot with the Lightning Labs team. There's actually someone's already built out a bridge from Spiderchain to Lightning, which is really cool. And I think I'm really excited about Bitcoin payments as well.
Do you have any final words you'd like to share with our audience? Any advice to those who are building DeFi projects on Bitcoin? Any final words you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would say speak to Bitcoiners and understand your users. I think I always joke that, crypto is a very small community, right? And even, there's not that many users at the end of the day in terms of DeFi. And I think what's really exciting here is the potential to 100x the DeFi users by tapping into Bitcoin. And what that entails is a very acute understanding of user behavior. We've done a lot of user segmentation exercises and understanding, okay, what does someone who owns 1 Bitcoin look like? What does someone who owns 0.1 Bitcoin look like? And what do they care about, right? What kind of user experience are they looking for? What is their level of risk aversion? And I think that level of insight into the user is what's going to truly set apart the winners of Bitcoin Fi or BTC Fi and even Bitcoin Layer 2s is understanding who you're speaking to. And it's fundamentally very different from anyone we've ever really interacted with before.
Awesome. Well, it was great to speak with you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And wishing the best of luck with Spiderchain.
Thank you.
And Botanix Labs.
Appreciate it. Thank you.